Hey, what's up? Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Roll Pod, an Alabama sports podcast from Bama 247. I'm your host, Cody Goodwin. We got the gang all back together here, Mike Rodak and Alex Scarborough, here to discuss some college football playoff rankings. Alabama in a pretty good position after the new poll that came out on Tuesday. Going to discuss also a little bit of the early signing period. I believe that's the exact phrasing that Brett taught me. It's no longer National Signing Day. It's just kind of like a collection of days where kids can sign and make their decision. And even then it's not final because they're not exactly signing a national letter of intent anymore, but also just, I don't know, exciting. There's 21 new members to the Alabama football program. So we'll discuss that a little bit. Also, it's conference championship weekend, which might be part of the playoff ranking conversation with games on Friday and Saturday, both Power 4, Group of 5, a lot of fun football on tap, a lot that also has playoff implications. So we'll discuss a little bit of that. But let's start with this college football playoff conversation. New rankings, the penultimate rankings. And Alabama's in a pretty good spot, guys. Checked in at number 11 overall. And if the playoffs were to have started this week or today or whatever, they would be in the bracket at 9-3. The CFP committee put Alabama at 11 over Miami. So 9-3 over 10-2. The selection committee chair, Ward Manuel, very, hey, like Alabama has 3 wins over current top 25 teams. Miami doesn't have any, just very straightforward, straight shooter to answer the question. There's still a lot that can happen. I don't know that it's a fully 100% guarantee that Alabama is going to be in the playoff. We're going to see what happens ultimately with 1, the conference championship games and the results of that, and 2, what that means for the final CFP rankings and the bracket and all of that stuff. But just the fact that Alabama, even at 9-3, is in position to potentially back in, and I would argue pretty good position to potentially back in. Alex, I'll let you start. What do we make of the fact that they're in this spot at all?
I'm a little surprised that the committee did the right thing, in my opinion. I thought they were going to take the easy way out, go with the 2-loss team, don't sort out the 3-loss teams and wash your hands of it. But they valued strength of schedule. I thought they weren't going to the point that I had a spicy little column ready to go saying that Greg Burns should back out of every big non-conference game and SEC should go away, not even consider 9 conference games. But here we are. So, yeah, the only curious thing to me is if you're going to value strength of schedule, which you should, and that's your rationale for putting Alabama ahead of Miami, why is South Carolina, which has a slightly better strength of schedule according to ESPN, not ahead of Miami as well? Am I picking nits? Sure. But at the end of the day, I think they did the right thing. So now we just wait on SMU Clemson and what the implications from that game is going to be.
That was an interesting discussion point, putting Alabama at 11, Miami at 12, and then Ole Miss, South Carolina, both at 13 and 14. There are also 9-3 SEC teams. Mike, what'd you make of Alabama's position, the committee's rationale, anything else that maybe came to mind after the rankings drop on Tuesday?
Yeah, I mean, they ultimately followed their principles as they're listed, which are strength of schedule, head-to-head competition, comparative outcomes of common opponents without incenting margin of victory, which, by the way, I'm pretty sure incenting is not a word. Other relevant factors such as availability or unavailability of key players and coaches that may have affected the team's performance. The last one didn't come into play this year. It did, obviously, last year with Florida State. And so then you're really looking at strength of schedule, head-to-head competition, and outcomes of common opponents, which Alabama and Miami did not have any common opponents, right?
No, they did not. Yeah. The closest it came was Virginia Tech, Vanderbilt played. It doesn't really matter.
Good. So really it's strength of schedule and head-to-head competition, and they didn't play. And so I think if you're the committee and you're taking your criteria very strictly, then it comes down to strength of schedule. If you feel like those two teams are very close. And so Alabama, I think, probably won on that, which, Ward Manuel, like you said, cited 3-1 against top 25 teams. Miami was 0-1. Baked into that is the fact that Alabama played 4 top 25 teams. Miami played 1. Louisville team that was probably right outside the top 25. I mean, they were in the polls this week. They were probably, the committee went to 30. They'd probably be in that top 30. But they weren't in the top 25. Teams above 500, I think, is the other one he used, which, again, the committee is going to use whatever stats they can kind of conjure up to make their particular argument. If they had said Miami was ahead of Alabama, they would have cited the games, the margin of victory against games on, the Oklahoma and Vanderbilt losses, like teams that were 6-6. Like, they would have made up some other stat that would have supported Miami over Alabama. So ultimately, it's just
came up with a good one. Bowl eligible record against bowl eligible teams on the road. That was a first. So.
Right, there would have been something that they would have used in either case. I was never truly expecting South Carolina to be ahead of Alabama. I think if South Carolina had won convincingly, strongly, bigly, if you will, over Clemson on the road, maybe that would have been a discussion, maybe. But that was not a convincing South Carolina win. I mean, Cade Klubnik threw a really strange pick when Clemson should have just ran the ball and kicked the field goal, and that game should have gone to overtime, and maybe Clemson wins.
But Mike, South Carolina's won 6 in a row. Lenora Sellers is an exciting player. Vibes.
Right. And I think if they had just absolutely pounded Clemson, there would have been a more legitimate discussion on, is South Carolina unequivocally ahead of Alabama, therefore head-to-head when it come into play. There's all these hypotheticals. I don't know how that one would have shaken out. But in this particular case, I don't think South Carolina was the real threat to Alabama. I think it was Miami. And I am a little bit surprised, as Alex said, just because Miami has 2 losses and Alabama has 3. And as silly as that might be, counting losses, that's kind of what the committee tends to do. Again, we talked about it on the show whenever over the weekend, Sunday, and I said that would have been the easiest way out. That would have been the bed that they could have slept in and just said, we're going to take a 2-loss team over a 3-loss team. And they could have, again, made up the stats to defend it, and that's the way that they could have gone. So I'm slightly surprised that they didn't, but I'm not surprised really that Alabama's in either. Of course, we say in right now, and it's not really true necessarily. Like, they might not be in. It's not going to change the order of Alabama, Ole Miss, South Carolina, Miami, but it's all about SMU, and we'll get into that. But I do think Ole Miss probably gets discounted a little bit too much. And, I do agree with Lane, like that head-to-head that Ole Miss has over South Carolina, in Columbia, 27-3. That should probably come into play. And I think it did, obviously, in the committee's eyes, because they had them ahead of South Carolina. Ole Miss is very strong in a lot of these metrics. They're top 6 in FPI. They're top 8 in Sagarin. Their strength of schedule is not as bad as people think. I mean, 31st is not bad. We just talked about it before the show. Wake Forest, Wisconsin. Wisconsin's better than Wake Forest, but it's not a massive gap in terms of what Alabama
gap. What? Said it's a 30-point gap, right?
Right. It's a 1-win gap. I mean, Wisconsin was 5-7. They had close game at home against Oregon. Wake Forest was 4-8. It's not astronomical, I think, the difference between those two teams. And I think, to your point about if it had been Miami over Alabama, what would be the fix for Alabama? Yeah, I guess in theory you could cancel your non-conference power conference games. The SEC could stay at 8 games, but I don't know if that would have fixed Alabama's problem this year. The problem was they lost at Oklahoma, they lost at Vanderbilt, and they lost at Tennessee. And none of those are affected by their non-conference schedule, and none of those are really affected by playing a 9th conference game, because they didn't do that this year. So you could do those things, but you still got to win the games you need to win. And if Alabama's ultimately left out on Sunday, if Clemson wins, then that's still to be blamed. And yeah, I mean, the non-conference schedule is there. I think Alabama's scheduled some good games, but that's hard to predict years in the future. And when they scheduled Florida State, or even as recently as last year, that looked like a tough game. Now they're going to Florida State in August, and they're coming off an absolutely horrendous season. That Wisconsin game, probably when they scheduled it, when Wisconsin was playing Ohio State in a Big Ten championship game, looked a little bit better. That game doesn't really look as good right now. It doesn't, the home game that they have next September doesn't look as good. As things stand right now, some of these other upcoming non-conference games for Alabama, like West Virginia and Oklahoma State, look terrible as well. Neil Brown just got fired at West Virginia. Mike Gundy should get fired at Oklahoma State, in my opinion, because I think that program has just gone in the tank.
They kind of took a Florida State-like slide because they were in the Big 12 championship game last year.
Right. And in fact, there are non-conference strength of schedule rankings. Alabama right now is 26 on teamrankings.com for their non-conference strength of schedule, which is actually less than Miami. Miami's at 13th. South Carolina's at 14th.
Well, we are not far away from Ohio State, Notre Dame. There are going to be some meaty non-conference games. And the point isn't whether it would affect this year. You're just adding risk to your schedule by playing those games. And if the committee is going to say Miami with 0 ranked wins can come in, why the hell would you play a game that's potentially against a ranked opponent? There's no point. There's no incentive to it. So if that had happened, that would be my take. And I don't want to jump ahead on the conversation, but even if SMU loses and is in, I still think that keep things the way they are, because there's a difference between a 1 regular season loss and 2.
But if you are able to win those games, which I think as things stand right now, they're probably able to win, West Virginia, Oklahoma State. We're talking years away. We don't know what those teams are going to look like. And then you're getting into a situation where you're actually helping yourself out, because that's where Alabama is right now. They're probably helped out over Ole Miss because they played a little bit of a stronger schedule than Ole Miss. But Ole Miss didn't get helped out in the sense that their SEC schedule wasn't as strong as Alabama's. And that's completely out of their control. That's just the SEC picking 8 teams this year. And that's a problem when you have a 16-team league. You're only playing half the conference. You can only play the games that you're picked to play. And so even if you lose 1 or 2, you're going to be docked a little bit because your SEC strength of schedule isn't as tough. And that's, so much of this is just kind of out of your control, which is problematic to me at least. But at the end of the day, Alabama played a tougher schedule than at least Ole Miss, not South Carolina, but that could also flip. We should note that if Clemson loses, then South Carolina's strength of schedule will get affected by that. It actually could fall back down below Alabama. I guess just to put a bow on it, I'm not sure getting rid of those non-conference games would make sense. I think Ohio State and Notre Dame would be the 2 that you would question, because right now, Oklahoma State, West Virginia, the Big 12 isn't really a power conference anymore. As much as they really aren't. So you're almost not playing a power conference opponent when you're playing those teams with the way things are trending. So it's almost like scheduling a group of 6, if you want to call it, group of 7 opponent now, which is kind of the direction this all seems to be going.
Oh, yeah. If you want to peek behind the curtain of my column that will never run, I did not mention those schools. I said Burns should call his fellow ADs at Ohio State and Notre Dame, and there might have been one more. But This is why I'm so conflicted, because I loathe the idea of automatic qualifiers to my bone. Like, I don't understand in an expanded playoff why they have to exist at all. But they're the only solution for the SEC if they want to play a difficult schedule, a fan-friendly, a TV-friendly schedule, a schedule where you're going to know who's the best people in the conference. You take the CFP out of it, the selection committee essentially out of it, and you say we get 4 bids or 5 bids no matter what. And then that frees up everybody in the conference to be more creative with scheduling. So I don't know what the solution is, but again, that's a tomorrow problem, not necessarily a today problem.
I just want them to go to Boston College in 2031.
I don't think that one's getting kicked off the schedule unless the 9-game conference schedule will affect non-conference games, because some of them are going to have to fall by the wayside. And it's going to be very interesting. I think the mid-tier non-conference games were the one on the chopping block. Now I wonder if the high, Ohio State games are the ones where they look at and go, do we really want to do that?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think Ohio State and Notre Dame games would be the 2 that I would question, just because you're probably going to see those teams in the playoff. I mean, in some form or fashion every year, like you have a chance of doing that because those teams are going to be right up there in recruiting and revenue sharing and all that. So I think you get rid of those and you keep the teams like Georgia Tech, Boston College, Arizona, Minnesota, Virginia Tech, Oklahoma State, West Virginia.
And to be clear, this is already happening. Friend of the show,
Right.
Ross Ellinger, wrote a good story about Indiana, and tucked in there was a comment from their athletic director saying that it was a strategy to pay $1 million to get out of the Army game?
The Louisville game, I'm pretty
Louisville
sure.
game, they
Louisville.
paid to get out of Louisville. Instead, they played Western, who the hell it was, and won by 74 points. They basically programmed their way into the playoff. So don't think that people aren't looking at that and saying, how can we do that too?
I will say this: Indiana, a lot's been made of the fact that they're 11-1, and the one team that they played. I guess I don't know. Like the fact that they were able to go beat Michigan probably looks a little bit better now since Michigan walked into Columbus and knocked them off. But
right.
Why do we talk about Indiana? Why do we not talk about Penn State in the same way we talk about Indiana? Their schedule's a hot mess, and nobody seems to care because they got pretty helmets. I don't understand it. I mean, it's not.
I have been told now that I live in SEC country that we only acknowledge the SEC and we don't give a rat's ass about the Big Ten. So I'm just trying to follow protocol.
I'm glad that you have realized our board stance on any team that is not part of the SEC automatically.
But this is why it's so hard. This is why it's so hard to predict what the committee is going to do, because there's different rules for different situations and different helmets and different conferences. And I don't know if there's a clean solution, but it makes our job trying to figure out what they're going to do damn near impossible.
Well, speaking of trying to figure out what they're going to do, there's a couple of scenarios here that I think are going to be intriguing to follow and track this coming weekend that could impact what the final CFP bracket looks like. We know that Alabama at 11, if the playoff were to start today, they would be in. They would be going to, looking at the bracket, they would be the 11 seed. They would be going to Notre Dame for the first round playoff game. It's not set in stone. Again, it was the penultimate rankings and the penultimate bracket where they'd be placed in, but a couple of scenarios that I wanted to run by you guys, just how it could impact what the final rankings and the final bracket could look like. The ACC championship game is obviously the big one that we are all going to be watching. That is Saturday night in Charlotte, SMU versus Clemson. You look at the rankings, SMU checked in at number 8. Clemson checked in at 17. The only way Clemson gets into the playoff is if they beat SMU. I believe SMU, I don't know if they open, but at last check, 2.5, 3-point favorite, SMU. So if SMU wins, I'm not sure much changes, right? They win the ACC. Clemson left out. ACC is a one-bid league. If Clemson wins, and this is the question I want to pose to you guys, and I think just kind of what we were dancing around / alluding to, what does the committee do with SMU? Because at the end of the regular season, like the penultimate rankings are the end of the regular season, everybody's played 12 games. They believe SMU is not just in the playoff, but pretty firmly a top 10 team. What happens if Clemson beats them? Does SMU then take Alabama's spot and they're the last team in? Does Alabama hop a 2-loss SMU team that lost in the ACC championship game? What do we think could potentially happen in that scenario, just based on what the committee has told us this season?
Honestly, I think it's going to be a tougher decision for them and a more controversial decision. I can't talk today. Decision for them than it was this past one, because you say 13th game, and that changes the math where you're just comparing teams that have played 12 games. Now you're comparing a team that's played 13 versus 12. And there's going to be inherent problems in both directions. And Warren Manuel has said it over and over again that the commissioners, the board of governors, whatever the hell they call it for the CFP, has told them to evaluate teams through the conference championship game. And that's, to me, a signal and a sign that they could just look at SMU's 13 games in their entirety, say that they haven't beaten anybody. Again, we're assuming a loss to Clemson in this scenario. And they will look at Alabama and cite the same stats it just did over Miami and say Alabama's 3-1 against top 25 teams, and SMU in that case would be 0-2. I believe they lost to BYU and would lose to Clemson in that case. And the same stats that they used to put Alabama over Miami. The strength of schedule is actually lower, I think, for SMU, or it would be after this game as well. They could use the same argument. However, I could also see the case being made by the committee that SMU played a 13th game. And I think there's probably going to be an amount of sensitivity from the committee about punishing conference championship participants granted, we're talking about the ACC, but I think there's also a fear or a worry on the part of the Big Ten and SEC commissioners that and ADs that they don't want their conference championship loser to be punished either. And so it's kind of like mutually assured destruction. Like, don't mess with them so you don't mess with us either. Like, I could see that coming into play where they don't want to upset the apple cart. They don't want to push a conference championship game loser out, because then SMU is just going to raise hell about why are we playing an ACC championship game. I think other conference ADs would probably get worried about why would we play in a conference title game either, if it's going to potentially leave us out when we would have otherwise been in. And
the water's warm. Come on in.
Right. That, and again, we've talked about it time and time again this year. And yeah, I've argued for Alabama's case to play in the SEC championship game, given its particular situation at that point in time, basically before the Oklahoma loss. This is different for SMU. The upside and the downside, it's a different calculus for them than it would be for Alabama in that particular case. So I think the argument changes. And yeah, like, they're a top 8 team right now. If this was a 12-team playoff without automatic bids, they would be hosting a playoff game. The way that they're doing it right now and having automatic bids, they could move up to 3 or 4. I guess there'd be a 3 seed, but you don't want to lose and fall out of the top 12. So that, I think it's like you don't want to open Pandora's box if you're the committee by going down that road. Because if you do it to the ACC, then you could do it to other conferences. And yeah, I think they would have done it anyway. Like, if A&M had beaten Texas and then a 4-loss A&M, loses to Georgia, I don't know if A&M's in the playoff. If LSU had gone through that ridiculous scenario that we talked about a few weeks ago and they had made the SEC championship game and they lost, I don't think they would have been in. But it's a tricky road when conferences are trying to preserve these conference title games and all the money and all the ticket sales and the TV ratings that come along with them. And then you have a team that plays in one when they otherwise would have been in the playoff, and they are knocked out for a team that was sitting at home and resting and by their own problems in Oklahoma is not playing in a conference championship game. So I think that sets a weird precedent as well. And I think it's a philosophical question of what they want to do.
I think whatever happens, Ward Manuel needs to make clear that it is not precedent, because I think in the case of conference championship games, you can say we're going to take this on a case-by-case basis, because you're right. If it was 4-loss LSU in an SEC championship game, they lose, they should not be in. There's no doubt about that. But I think in the case of SMU, you could make the argument, because their strength of schedule is so bad, that is 13 mid games that much different than 12 difficult ones.
Right.
I don't know.
It's the same thing that we talked about earlier. It's always the luck of the draw in terms of how the conference schedules your games. And if the ACC, and I don't know personally, I don't cover them, how they do their scheduling formula, but if the ACC gave SMU, Clemson on the road, which again, this game is basically on the road for SMU. I mean, it's in Charlotte, and they gave that as a regular season game for SMU instead of going to Virginia or instead of going to Duke, and they lost that game, and you're now a 10-2 SMU team. Like, you wouldn't be in the playoff picture right now. In fact, I don't think you would be in the ACC championship game either. I don't know how that would have fallen. So it's really just the luck of the draw, probably in your favor, that you didn't play Clemson during the season, and now you're playing them as a 13th game. So it's tricky, man.
I'm on the record saying that whenever the selection committee chair starts talking, stop listening.
Right.
But he did leave the door open, right? His comments on SMU basically said, we're going to keep judging them, long story short. But more than his comments, the fact that they did not rank Louisville I think that was them saving an out if they want to kick SMU out of this. Do I think they should? Barring a 3 or 4 touchdown loss, I don't think they should at all. Because in the case of Miami versus Alabama, you're talking about the difference of 1 regular season loss. And it's totally different when you're talking about 2. Well, you can't kick an 11-1 team, regular season team out because they lost an extra game. That just seems patently unfair to me. So I don't know how they do it, but the skeptic in me keeps looking at what was said and what was done with the rankings, and they're leaving that door open.
I think that you should put that on our board right now. It would be unfair to leave SMU as a one-loss regular season champion out.
Yell at me all you want. I mean, honestly, they haven't lost since the third week of the season. The last 4 games they won by double-digit points or more. Or more is a dumb thing to say. Double-digit points or like 3 touchdowns. Like, they're controlling the game. They're playing very good football. Like, forget the ACC part of it. Like, they're a good football team that has earned their way into the playoff. So again, barring Clemson boat racing them, I think they deserve a chance to overcome a single loss that nobody else had to risk.
Which brings me to my next point, and I'm sorry to steal Cody's thunder in this one, but if we're going down that road,
this is where I wanted to go next.
Let's talk about the team with the blue field.
Yeah.
The Boise State Broncos have played a schedule to date that is 86th in ESPN strength of schedule rankings. SMU is 75th. SMU's going to get a little bit higher by playing Clemson, whereas Boise State's going to get higher by playing UNLV, but that gap's probably going to grow. However, it's not a huge difference in terms of strength of schedule. Boise State's only loss this season was by 3 points on the road to Oregon, the number 1 team in the country. They do not have a top 25 win. Otherwise, they have not. Or sorry,
they beat UNLV in the regular season, and that's part of this too. Boise State has to beat UNLV a second time in order to hold their current playoff position. That's another weird just thought to consider here.
I will say, in this case, the game is at home for Boise. So if you're talking about a home loss for Boise that maybe hurts them, is there a universe, as Cody likes to say, and accurately so, that Boise loses to UNLV in a close game and the committee does not touch them? You asked me 6.8 days out of the week, I would say Boise loses and they're out. But if we're making this argument for SMU, then some of the same logic might need to apply to Boise. With the
it's an interesting philosophical discussion.
I'm sympathetic to the argument.
Yeah.
But the world where that exists is like a world called Portlandia. It's not going to happen.
Right.
Because this committee doesn't care about Group of 5 teams. They just don't.
And that's the problem, is that they play in the Mountain West as compared to the ACC. And at the end of the day, as I said earlier in the show,
is there really a difference between the Mountain West and the ACC?
Those are probably both Group of 7 teams is probably the new way that we should phrase this. But
my SEC is showing. I hope our board is happy.
If the arguments exist for SMU, then some of the same arguments would need to exist for Boise, with the caveat that Boise is already lower. They're 10th. SMU's 8th. So you're talking about there's more room for SMU to fall and still be in the playoff. There's really no room for Boise to fall. But man, that 3-point loss on the road to Oregon is interesting because that's all that is keeping them from being undefeated right now. Look, I said 6.8 days out of the week, I would say they're automatically out. 0.2 days out of the week, maybe the committee gets frisky.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Think the ACC is a better conference than the Mountain West. Do I think it's a huge gap? No. But at last check, I think the ACC had 13 of 17 teams ranked above 500. I think the Mountain West has 4 teams, 5 teams that are 500 or better.
Yeah, Sagarin's conference rankings, he has ACC 4th, above the Pac-12, which Pac-12 doesn't exist. He has Sun Belt East ahead of the Mountain West, the Sun Belt Eastern Division ahead of the Mountain West. But Mountain West there's not a gigantic gap in terms of, I think they're obviously the best Group of 5 conference right now.
Yeah. The better argument for Boise is not the conference piece of it; it's the quality of the loss to Oregon.
Right.
I don't think the committee is going to be sympathetic to it all, even if I am.
They may not be, and it's not. I don't think it's like I know that game's in Boise, and Boise's looked really, really good. And Ashton Jeanty's probably going to be in New York for the Heisman ceremony, but that's when they played in the regular season. UNLV had a lead in the 4th quarter of that game, and I think they're one of the few teams, if not the only team this season, that has found a way to not stop Ashton Jeanty, because I don't know that you can actually stop him, but they made him work for his yards and they slowed him down a little bit, and he was not able to run on them. That may change when they're playing on the Smurf turf and maybe Boise State wins running away and this is a non-factor, but that was a thought that did pop into my head too, the way that we've been talking about SMU Clemson. Does it apply to Boise State as well, just because of where they're at? And so I'm glad you brought that up, Mike. Look at you expanding your horizons. This is good. This is really good.
I think the only way that would even be a conversation would be like a field goal, a game-winning field goal by UNLV in the last second. And it would have to be like the closest of all close games, I think, for that to even be something that the committee would discuss with any, more than 5 seconds on Sunday, basically, over breakfast at the Gaylord Hotel. The hotel formerly known as Gaylord, just like the Oklahoma Stadium that is now named after Alex Scarborough.
What's the name of the hotel now?
Scarborough Hotel.
Better get a good rate.
That's right. And the same thing, obviously, like we said with SMU, like they can't get blown out by Clemson and still have a strong argument over Alabama. I think that has to be a pretty close game. So if Alabama's looking to get into the playoff, they either need SMU to win or they need Clemson to blow the doors off of SMU. I think those are the two scenarios. And I don't know which, if Alabama fans are rooting for Dabo Swinney or rooting against them. It's a very strange dichotomy of rooting interest for Alabama.
And also, what is Dabo's motivation if they do have a lead and he knows he can? What's the Karate Kid thing where you can finish them off? I can't remember what it's called. The move in Karate Kid. Nobody knows the Karate Kid.
I've never watched that movie. You're showing your age. That's what, 80s?
Never seen Karate Kid?
No. What year did that movie come out?
Jesus.
I've not seen it in full.
Nice.
I've seen scenes here and there, but I've not.
That
I'm not
movie
actually
is
sat and watched the whole thing.
40 years old. 40
Okay.
years old.
The Godfather's
older than me.
older. I've seen it like
I've never seen The Godfather.
Oh.
Okay, I've at least seen The Godfather. Okay, you can't hold that against me.
This is like an annual discussion among people who know me, is that I haven't seen a lot of these movies. However, I was making Spaceballs references, and that's an 80s movie in a recent pick. So maybe it's not entirely true for me.
Anyways, what's Dabo's motivation? Never forget that Clemson is suing the ACC. Do they really want to do the ACC a favor and let off the gas if they think they could just boat race SMU?
There's also a Clemson team that when you look at some of their scores, they're not afraid to run it up. They ran it up against App State. They put 59 on NC State, 40 on Stanford, 49 on Wake. The 49-13 win over SMU. If they position themselves to have that possibility by the fourth quarter, that would not surprise me. I don't know if that's a large enough gap to kick SMU out of the field, but
see Dabo pulling his cell phone out during the game and texting Greg Byrne and said, "You should have called," and then going out and scoring 5 touchdowns, or not doing it, and then could have controlled this.
The Alabama Alumni Association should just send him an email during the game. Please donate to us in the form of a blowout win.
Yes.
Roll Tide. I did enjoy Bob Welton, by the way, on their little signing day show yesterday. They did. Very funny guy.
Yes.
The director of player personnel for Alabama said that they might allow Keelan Russell to play in this game for SMU. He came, he was an SMU commit before this, and he's like, "Yeah, we might let you play against Clemson so you can win that game and get us in the playoff." Basically, is what he was saying, but maybe a little bit too honest.
Shots fired.
I appreciate that comment because now I can pivot to one of the other two things that I wanted to discuss on today's show, and that is both Alabama's signing class and the other conference championship games that are coming up this weekend. Mike, you're like waving.
It's not signing day anymore. Like you said, it's not early signing period. It's rookie free agency. This is what this is. And then you have veteran free agency, which starts next week with the transfer portal. Tell me I'm wrong. That's what this is. Like, did
You're
you
not
not
wrong.
see I forget his name. He works for us. Blair on our board last night saying Derek Meadows' signing ceremony was coming down to the last minute because the lawyers were trying to finish the paperwork on essentially his contract with Alabama.
Rookie free agency.
This is free agency, y'all. It's rookie free agency, and then it's veteran free agency. Right. And I don't know why we still have these silly names for things that, it's like student athletes, like stuff like that. These marketing terms, like call it what it is. It's rookie free agency and it's veteran free agency. So that's what we're in right now.
The student athlete moniker is going to stick though, because I'm pretty sure they still have to like take a class or like a certain amount of hours in order to play, right?
It's more of a legal term at this point.
Yeah,
perhaps. We'll touch on signing day in just a minute. I wanted to touch on some of the other conference championship games. There's 9 of them in total. We're going to be kind of loosely paying attention to Boise UNLV. All eyes are going to be on SMU Clemson. Are we interested in the others? I know the SEC is Georgia Texas, like we all thought and predicted. The Big Ten, a little bit of a small surprise with Oregon and Penn State. The Nittany Lions snuck in after Michigan took down Ohio State. The Big 12, Arizona State, Iowa State. I know you guys don't care about that, but I'm going to be watching that on Saturday morning. And then some of the other, so you've got Louisiana Marshall, you've got Miami of Ohio versus Ohio. Friday night, Army, Tulane, mentioned Boise, UNLV, and then Western Kentucky, Jacksonville State as well. Do any of those pique your interest? Are you going to be watching any of those? Or are you guys just going to save all of your viewing screen time for Saturday?
Probably the latter. I mean, none of those really interest me. I think, the SEC is interesting, and I would still doubt Georgia at your own risk. I know they've been a hell of a ride this year. They've also played a very difficult schedule. Obviously the Kentucky game, the Georgia Tech game, the Florida game to some extent, like they've shown the ability to lose a lot. If you're telling me Georgia wins it all, like, would I be surprised? No. And would you tell me that Georgia wins this game against Texas? Would not be. And look, Georgia might play. I guess they'd have to lose to Texas for this to be true. But they could play in Atlanta. They are playing in Atlanta this weekend. If they lose and they go to the Peach Bowl.
Well, if Georgia loses, if they win the SEC, they go to New Orleans, right? Because conferences
in a Sugar Bowl. But if they lose, they play a first round game, they win that. I would have to see where the seedings would fall. Would they go and play the ACC champion in the Peach Bowl? It's possible. You play in Atlanta again, and then you win that game, and then you go to a semifinal game, and then you win that. Guess what? You're going back to Atlanta. It's like Georgia has potentially 3 home games to get and win a national championship, which is certainly helpful. And I think they're still a good team. And if they get their crap together, especially on defense, and offense for that matter, but if they get their crap together in general, they're hard to beat. And they have this ability just to score, down at Alabama, down against Georgia Tech. And it's like, boom, they score like that. It's crazy. I would still watch out for Georgia. I know it sounds crazy based on everything we've seen this year from them, but
they're similar from Alabama in the whole hot and cold thing, right? Because when they're good, watch out. It's a freight train. We watched them go into Austin earlier this year and win that one by 2 scores. And even then it didn't really look like it was that close, but then they went and got thumped pretty good in Oxford. We saw what happened in the first half against Alabama. And then, obviously we saw what happened the rest of that game, but I don't know. Strange team.
I mean, they could still lose to Texas and still go do the damn thing. It's possible.
Yeah. They're playing with a lot of goodwill. I want to say at this point, they've shown us who they are. But at the same time, we have seen in professional sports time and time again that teams can flip a switch when something big is on the line and they can go win the whole thing. Does that apply to 18, 19, 20, 21-year-olds? I don't know. I tend to think probably not. But if we're just talking about pure talent, I mean, they're right up there with Texas. They're right up there with Ohio State, which pooped the bed. But stranger things have happened. I tend to think at this point, we know what Georgia is.
So Mike's only going to watch the SEC championship game. Alex, are you going to watch any of the
SEC championship game? But
that was the only one you brought up in discuss,
right? ACC is after the SEC, so
ACC and Big Ten are both Saturday night at 7:30. SEC is 3 p.m. Saturday. Big 12, if anybody cares. Me, 11 a.m. on Saturday morning. Alex, are you going to watch any of the other ones or just the SEC and the ACC?
No, I don't plan to turn on my TV to watch football until 3 o'clock, and then I will watch the rest of the night.
Well, all right.
Yeah.
I guess I'll let you guys know how the Big 12 championship game goes because I'm kind of excited to watch that.
Great.
No, post it on the board and see how many people respond.
No, why would I do that? They don't think the Big 12 exists, so I'm not gonna try and convince them otherwise. I just know a lot of kids that play on the Iowa State team, because I was there forever. So until that roster totally washes out of kids that I used to cover when they were in high school, I'll pay attention. I'll see what's going on. It's a weird connection thing. I don't know. It'll be the same way with Alabama. If I ever don't cover Alabama, I'll know a lot of kids on the roster. So naturally, I'm just going to tune in. Speaking of kids on the roster, Alabama welcomed 21 new members to the program on Wednesday, officially with the early signing period. Make sure we get that correct. 21 total commitments. Believe they welcomed 3 5-star guys, a lot of other top 100 recruits. They got a late flip in the day. Derek Meadows, the receiver from Bishop Gorman in Nevada, he flipped from LSU to Alabama, was kind of the cherry on top. Wanted to kind of throw it out. I know I had a conversation with Brett earlier this week as kind of a primer to signing day. Plan on circling back with him next week to kind of tie a bow on the 2025 signing class, but I figured I'd throw it out to you guys as well. What did we like about Alabama's signing class? What did we not like? What are kind of our initial thoughts on the new members of the program? Who are we excited to watch? Who do we think could play early? I'm purposely leaving it open-ended. Alex, I'll let you go first.
My first thing is a question to you two. Do we give a damn about in-state recruiting? I don't.
No, but also I understand why it kind of matters, right? Especially like when you're the head coach at Alabama. And in this case, I know we're at kind of a loose conversation with Auburn as well. You want to have those relationships with high school coaches all around the state, especially when it's a state that I don't know how it compares year to year, but I know every year there's always a lot of talented kids. And so you want to have those relationships with coaches. So I understand why in-state recruiting matters. At the same time, you're not trying to win the in-state recruiting battle. You're trying to contend for top 5, top 2, the number 1 class every single year. And sometimes that means going out of state.
And those relationships should evolve and change with time. So I just wanted to get that part out of the way because there's a huge segment or a loud segment, I don't know which is which, that really cares about that. But I thought the staff did the damn thing. I mean, honestly, they're number 2 in the rankings right now. I'm not sure they can fall below 3rd the way things stand. It was weird that they loaded up so early. Talking about the summer, that most of the class was already finished, but they closed. I was worried that, you start that early, you get guys picked off, and yeah, you lose a Caleb Cunningham. But man, if you're going to lose Caleb Cunningham and you go get a Derek Meadows, it's a pretty good trade with his size and his measurables, what he can do on a football field. The offensive lineman, big, addressed needs in terms of secondary, because I don't know how much they're going to be able to do that in the portal. Because I think that's going to be a tough sell with all the players who contributed or coming back. And then I think one of the 2 most exciting players to me to watch are going to be Justin Hill, the edge rusher, because there's such a need at that position. And then A.K. Deer, the running back, because I'm very curious to see who comes back out of that trio of backs with Jam Miller, Justice Haynes, and Richard Young. Number 2 back in the country, I believe, can really play. I like what they did with this class an awful lot. Mike's going to say that it doesn't matter until we see how long they stay and all that stuff, and that's all true. But this staff did the thing they were supposed to do, which is show they can recruit. Never forget that was the thing when he got hired. Husky Harson, he's not going to recruit anybody. Not so fast.
Husky, I have never heard that, but
You've never heard Husky Harson? Oh,
no.
Yeah.
Was it on our board?
It might have been. I know it's on Twitter an awful lot, and it's a clever nickname, but untrue.
I guess it makes sense, but Kalen's more svelte than he was at Washington. So
stress will get you.
Right. Well, I'm saying he's probably lighter than like when he was at Washington. If you look at some of the photos, like I think he's done well for himself.
I don't think he's husky. I'm just saying that's the term.
The Southern calories haven't gotten to DeBoer yet, is what you're saying?
Right. I was just doing some of the math. Yeah, I think you're right in terms of Alabama not being able to fall below 3rd. They will fall to 3rd once Justice Terry makes it official with Georgia. But Oregon and Ohio State, each of those has one guy in the top 200 that's still left out there that they're supposed to get. But even if they do, they're going to be slightly behind Alabama. So yeah, it's 3rd is kind of where it's looking. It's going to end unless there's something crazy that happens. And who the hell knows without national letter of intent anymore? National letters of intent, I should say. I feel like they're somewhat binding now with the grant and aid agreement, but I guess we'll find out if a kid decides to recant on one of these, like what's going to happen. But it seems like it's
not if, when. It may not be Alabama, but it's going to happen.
Right. So. Yeah, exactly. We'll have to see, if these things are challenged at all. But it seems like as things have trended, your class is now done by December, and a lot of these kids are going to enroll early. They're going to be here for bowl practice or playoff practice, whatever it is, in a couple weeks. So, yeah, I mean, I remember we did a roundtable for our site probably back in the summer, maybe, or even in the spring, and we asked like what's realistic for Alabama to finish. And I don't know if any of us said top 5. I think we said maybe top 10 would be realistic. And at that point, they were probably in the 20s in terms of recruiting. Even when you factor, you know what? We're missing something here. I was going to say, even when you factor Caleb Cunningham already having left, we're forgetting that Ty Haywood's not going to be with Alabama. So
he hasn't officially signed yet. And I think just the intel is, it seems like Michigan is maybe ponying up to find its offensive tackle to protect Bryce Underwood.
Yeah, and Mike Roach reported for us on Tuesday, I believe it was, that Haywood's not expected to end up at Alabama. So he's still in our system right now as being an Alabama commit because he hasn't officially decommitted, done his little graphic or as players do for that. But if you take away Haywood from this class, that brings them down to 297. So that would put them at team rankings
5 or 6.
Yeah, that's going to put them down at 5 right now. They would still stay ahead of Auburn, but that we should make that clear. Like they're probably going to end up at 5, still top 5. Once Haywood is not part of this class, unless there's some late add. But again, there's nobody really left out there in the top 247. So number 5 is more realistic to where they'll be. Sorry to mess that up, but still, a good job by this staff. I'm not the least bit concerned that they don't have Alabama players. I think you go out and you find players where they are. Derek Meadows went to Bishop Gorman, which I believe is the same place as Jeremy Bernard. Bernard went to Liberty, but they're both from Las Vegas. Like, who the hell cares? Jeremy Bernard's been a good player for Alabama this year. The fact that he's not from Alabama or Louisiana or Georgia doesn't mean he plays less hard or doesn't mean that he's soft or some of these real ridiculous stereotypes that get put on players for not being from Alabama or being from the South. So, Derek Meadows flips yesterday. You have Dijon Lee as a 5-star corner. Oh, wait, who else is a 5-star corner on this team from California? Both of your starting corners are 5-star corners from California. Michael Carroll. I wonder, have they ever gotten a offensive lineman from IMG Academy before? Yeah, I've gotten a few. Those guys have been pretty good. So,
almost sounds like you're frustrated by this narrative.
I mean, they have a quarterback from Texas on the current roster. I don't know if people want another one of those based on some of the reaction to Jalen on our board, but I do think Keelan Russell is going to be a more complete quarterback than Jalen. I think as a passer, certainly has a much higher upside in terms of what he's going to be able to do for him.
Just to be clear, he can fly. Mm-hmm. He has athleticism.
Right. But in terms of being a passer as well, this is a guy who has been compared to Jaden Daniels. I've gotten some comparisons to Patrick Mahomes, I know, in terms of people.
Did you guys see the hat that he picked when he was on his official visit with Alabama? They have the NFL draft room, and they let the kids pick the hats of what I presume is their favorite teams. Did you see the hat that Keelan Russell picked?
Cody immediately slotted him in as QB1 when he saw
he picked the Chiefs hat.
So, I mean, look, the class is going to be about Keelan Russell. It's like the Bryce Young class in 2020, with the exception of they also had Will Anderson in that class. But it's all going to be about the quarterback. When you have a quarterback of that caliber, it's all going to be about how soon does he play. And I think Keelan had a little bit of a signal on that when he was on that show yesterday. Said some of these guys can play early, and guys want to play early, and that's the truth. Because if they don't play early, then they might be gone in a year or two. There's no guarantees that you're just going to keep these guys and have them develop behind the scenes, and they're going to be a starter for you in 2 or 3 years. That stuff doesn't happen a lot anymore. It happens, but not a lot. And you have freshmen on this team starting. So it'd be really interesting to see how Keelan Russell does in the spring and in fall camp, and if he ends up being the better option for Alabama over Ty Simpson. So that's going to be the story of the class to me. I think there's certainly other players I can see contributing right away. I think Carroll would be a really interesting potential starter at left guard to replace Tyler Booker, who also played as a freshman, not as a starter, but a decent amount as a freshman 3 years ago. They're both receivers. I would wonder what further exits there are from this receiver group. We've already had Kobe Prentice. I think there certainly could be a couple more.
Yeah.
And I think there could be opportunities for that third guy to step in. Now it could be a portal guy. There are already poking around portal receivers. So, but you have some receivers that maybe could get on the field early. We'll see. Some of the other guys I think would probably be more role players. Your two JUCO bandits would be the guys that I think have a chance to play early, starting with the fact that they're JUCO players and their eligibility is a little bit different. You're not starting as out of high school as a freshman. So that changes the math a little bit. Cavante Henry being, the more experienced of those two, I would say. And we'll see what happens at bandit because you're losing Latham. Well, he's not even a bandit anymore. He's now a wolf. But LT Overton, I think, has probably one of the bigger draft decisions of any Alabama player. And if he doesn't come back, then you really need some help there. And that would be another position where I could see some guys playing early.
A lot of California flavor in this signing class. You got, obviously, you mentioned Dijon Lee's from Mission Viejo, Jackson Lloyd, one of the many offensive linemen. He's from, I think it's pronounced Carmel. Another Mater Dei cornerback, and Chuck McDonald, Caleb Edwards, tied in from El Dorado Hills. So a lot of those relationships that I believe they started forming when DeBoer was at Washington, clearly paying dividends. They're able to bring a lot of those guys to Tuscaloosa. A couple of thoughts, I guess, on this signing class. And I mentioned this to Brett in the earlier show. You look at kind of the offensive signees, it feels really complete, right? Like you've got Keelan, you've got a bevy of offensive linemen that when they were doing their cold summer thing, build the wall to protect your 5-star quarterback, right? I felt like they did that. You've got AK Deer, you've got a handful of pass catchers with Meadows and the couple of tight ends. Like the offensive signees feel really complete. Defense, not as much, right? Like they have some really good defensive backs mentioned: Dijon Lee, Chuck McDonald, Ivan Taylor, son of Ike Taylor. That guy's got the pedigree. He's a ball player. I think he's going to come in and have the opportunity to play snaps pretty early. But then you look at kind of the linebackers, they look, good athletes, maybe a little bit more developmental. And that's a position group I worry about a little bit just because I don't think Deontay Lawson's coming back. We know Jihad Campbell's not coming back. Justin Jefferson's out of eligibility. So not a lot of experience in the middle of the defense there. A little worried there. And then also defensive line, you've got the two JUCO guys. You've also got London Simmons. That's another position group that could potentially turn over quite a bit between this year and next year. Mike, I know you've made note of that as well. I don't know. I'm a little worried about that. I think you can kind of see where they may target guys in the portal once that opens next week, primarily the defensive front. It's kind of funny coming into this season. We looked at Alabama's defense and it's like, all right, the defensive front is not overly great, but it's good, right? Like you had the linebackers there, you had experience on the D line, and it was like, all right, can the secondary get their act together for the defense to come together? Now, this is a way too early prognostication, but going into the spring, right? I don't know that we're terribly worried about the secondary just because of the pieces that they've got coming in and perhaps returning, right? You'll have Zabian Brown, Jalen Mbakwe's played quite a bit. You've got Bray Hubbard, and we believe Keon Sabb will probably be back. So secondary's in a pretty good spot. And then you look at the defensive front, and it's just like, I don't know, man. Like you've got like James Smith and a bunch of backup singers. And it's just, I don't know what is going to come of that. Like, obviously those are going to be the portal targets, but those were kind of the thoughts that came into my head when I was looking at this signing class.
I mean, sorry, I'll just make a quick thought. I know Alex had his mouth open. It's a weird way of putting it.
Yeah, okay.
I was just going to say, don't forget about Quay Russo. I think Quay Russo, James Smith, I think are two players in the front seven you can kind of pencil in as starters next year. You have some supporting players. Damon Payne, I think, is a player who probably could be back. He has one more year left, could play a big role next year. Yanze Pierre could be a role player. I think they like their young guys at inside linebacker, whether it's Okoronkwo. I think they kind of like Jeremiah Alexander. I know Kane was kind of mentioning that recently. Caden Jones has played some football for him this year. I just don't know if you want to go into next year with only those guys. I think you probably need a veteran, at least one, at inside linebacker to have kind of an insurance policy there.
Yeah. Or, one of those things where you bring in an experienced guy, but then you kind of behind the scenes challenge the Okoronkwo's and the Joneses and, hey, like we brought this guy in to bring experience to the room, but overtake him, right?
That's exactly what they did with the secondary. And I thought they walked a very fine line of getting guys who they knew they could turn to if they had to, but their hope was that they didn't have to right away. So, yeah, I'm very curious to see not just what they do in the portal, but whether the collective side of things can drop a bag in somebody's lap and say, do you really want to go to the pros? Whether that's LT Overton. Keenan has one more year of eligibility, right?
He does, yeah.
Now, in the highlight video, he says last game in the Denny, and I don't know if that's this year or his entire career. He might be a guy you can convince to come back. There's always one or two guys that are kind of fringe that you can kind of walk back from the edge. Jeremy Bernard might command a little bit more money, I think, but it would really help on the defensive side of the ball to get a little bit of depth there. And then just really hope that you can develop guys over the course of the offseason, not just at inside linebacker, which is going to obviously be huge, but you got to get pass rushers. I've been saying it all year. They cannot create pressure on the quarterback without sending numbers, and that is a dangerous game to play. They got to figure out a way around that.
Mm-hmm.
I also wonder, and this is, again, way too early, maybe better suited for the spring or maybe even off-season pod, but I do wonder, you mentioned Quay Russaw. He's been very, very good at that Wolf position. I wonder if they maybe pivot him to kind of what Jihad Campbell has been this year. I think he's athletic enough that he can kind of be that queen on the chessboard. You're going to have to maybe coach him up a little bit in terms of how to play on the inside. But like that could be an option, right? That brings you a little bit of experience on the inside. It still gives Kane kind of that, okay, where do we want to put this guy to wreak havoc on the offense? Because also Yanze Pierre has played quite a bit in recent weeks. Could he potentially evolve into that Wolf? And then you've got a little bit of depth and a little bit of versatility in the front seven. I think I'd feel pretty good about that. I don't know if that's in their plans, but it is a thought that I had just watching Quay play the last few weeks.
Possible because he has the size to handle being in the middle. But I hate when coaches do this when they take somebody who's a talented pass rusher and put it in the middle because you're negating in a large sense what they do well. Hello, Harold Perkins. I mean, if the guy is your best pass rusher off the edge at this point, assuming Overton doesn't come back, I don't know that I really want to mess around with that too much. It's a question of motivation at that point. What does Quay want to do? If he does want to cross train and see if it works, it would be a nice thought. But I'm very hesitant if you've got somebody who can win one-on-one battles to throw him in the middle where that's a little bit more difficult to do.
I think you'd have to lose 10 pounds, roughly. Yeah. He's in the 250s right now. I mean,
easier to lose than gain.
Yeah, Campbell's like in the low 240s. So, but I mean, if you told me that Quay Russaw gained 10 or 15 pounds and played bandit, I don't think that's the worst idea in the world either. Yeah. I mean, like,
it depends on what they do in the portal. It depends on whether Justin Hill can be a dude right away. They've got options. I just don't know that they have a ton of sure things.
They also have Keon Keeley. Oh, okay. I guess not. I'm sorry. We're being mean to Keon. And he actually got on the field.
I am being mean.
Well, you could have said yes to have Keon Keeley. That's a great player. You didn't do that. So you were also being mean to him by extension.
I didn't come to his immediate defense, but I don't know that I was outwardly mean to him.
I mean, that's a player. Yeah, he got on the field at the end of the Iron Bowl. It's probably a case of go show us something. It was like 4 plays or whatever, and that's about the most we've seen of him in a game that's mattered in 2 years. So I don't know where that puts him for next year. I think there's obviously a point of, do you go into the portal and just look for a fresh start? Are we there yet with him, or is it an opportunity now with potentially some bandits leaving next year and you try to go through the spring and see if you got a shot? I don't know. And he's probably on the fringe of that conversation. I think you probably want to bring somebody in that's more experienced, but at least a player worth mentioning, I would say.
Before we sign off here, I want each of us to give one player that we believe will play early out of the 2025 signees. Alex, I'll let you start.
Keelan Russell, I think will play.
Keelan.
Yeah, Keelan. Is it Keelan or is it Keelan?
Yeah, Kalen. This is going to be annoying as hell. Kalen corrected Tony last night. It was subtle, but in a noticeable way. Tony asked about Keelan Russell, and then Kalen began his answer by saying, Keelan. It was very like, you didn't pronounce his name right.
It's easier than Tua.
Kalen and Keelan.
I think he will play. Now, does this mean he's the starter all season long or to start the season or any of that? I don't know. I still like Ty Simpson a lot. But I think you bring that guy in to see what he's got, and I don't think you wait too terribly long to do it. we've got to see what he can do in terms of understanding the playbook. He's got to add some weight. He's very thin, but those traits don't come along very often. He can put the football anywhere on the field. That he can run. He's a guy who I think they're going to turn to at some point, whether that's meaningful snaps or not. I just think we're going to see him, and I think we're going to see him potentially more than we saw Ty this year if they can play up to kind of what they want to do, because you got to get that guy ready.
Yeah, I would agree with that pick. I mean, it's between him and Carroll for me, because I think Carroll is probably a plug and play sort of player. You don't really have an obvious replacement at guard. We'll have to see what happens with Jaden Roberts, because he's draft eligible. Like, what does he do? You have Gino Vandemark, but you just don't really have an obvious next guy up at left guard. I mean, Olas Allen and Rock Montgomery, I don't really know if they would start over Michael Carroll if all things are equal. So that'll be one guy. But yeah, Keelan is a guy that I'm not too worried about the weight, because how many stories have we heard or even written ourselves about, their staff and David Ballou and the super high tech machines that they have and all this technology and their nutritionists and all that. Like, there's always a story by August of like, here's what this player has lost, here's what this player has gained, and these side-by-side photos. And if we're talking about that by August, like, it would not shock me in the least.
And Jaden Daniels never really filled out, and he's doing quite all right.
Right. Especially after listening to, Courtney and Kalen to some extent talk about Keelan for the first time yesterday, publicly at least. Like, I get the sense that they really, really like the guy. If you do really, really like a guy like that, I don't think you have to keep him off the field for any particular reason of he's a freshman, we're not going to start him. Like, I think that idea has kind of fallen by the wayside in college football. There's been a lot of good freshman quarterbacks out there. And, does that mean you're starting him day one? He's taking the first snap in Bill Campbell Stadium in Tallahassee, and there's 100,000 people and doing the, all that. Like, I don't know if that's the situation you want him starting in. The Tua 2017 year, where Tua was getting more and more playing time and then ends up playing for Alabama in a key moment in a national championship game. Maybe that's kind of a parallel. But I can also see him starting games by the middle of the season. Like, if he's ready and he's better than Ty, as Kalen likes to say, cut it loose. That's what he says. Cut it loose.
Yeah. No, I think the Keelan thing is interesting, because also DeBoer specifically has a history of playing two quarterbacks, right? You remember his year as OC at Indiana, they played both Peyton Ramsey and Michael Penix quite a bit. So I could see that dynamic here, depending on how Keelan develops through the spring, summer, and into the fall. Also, if he does need a full year of development or to grow, fill out his body a little bit so that he's ready for, not just D1 game, but week in and week out of the SEC grind. Like, maybe he just needs time to develop a little bit. You do have Ty there, right? And I think we're all interested and pretty high on what Ty Simpson can bring to Kalen DeBoer's offense. I also like Michael Carroll. He looks like Tyler Booker 2.0. I think if you're able to bring both guards back, right, Jaden Roberts and Gino Vandemark, I have no reason to believe why Gino might leave, but you plug Roberts in as long as he's healthy at right guard. You start Gino, I think, at left guard. And then, the way Booker kind of, I don't know that he started, but he played quite a bit his freshman year. You could probably do something similar with Michael Carroll to kind of help him get up to speed. And maybe he ultimately overtakes and starts at left guard for, the second half of the season, or maybe you just split time the entire way through. But I think that's something you can do. I'm going to take the easy pick, the other 5-star guy, Dijon Lee. I think we still don't know what's going to happen with Damani Jackson, but I think he's played well enough that he could probably get taken probably sometime day 2 in the NFL draft this year. So that's going to open up opportunity, right? I know that they have Jalen Mbakwe still there in the cornerback room. I really like Jalen Mbakwe. I think there's going to be opportunity, and it wouldn't shock me at all to see them throw Dijon Lee, who's pretty big for a corner, right? 6'4", 190. So wouldn't shock me at all to see him play a little bit. Maybe he factors into the Husky conversation. Maybe he's, CB2 next to Xavier Brown. Maybe they just do a weird thing where they cycle all 3 guys through. I don't know. Like, there's not a ton of depth there. So I think you want to get a lot of guys experience at that particular position. And when you got a 5-star guy, it makes sense to throw him to the fire pretty quickly, in the same way that we've been talking about Keelan and Michael Carroll. So yeah, that's really all we've got today, guys. We'll be back Sunday or Monday, kind of TBD at the moment, to recap what happens with the final college football playoff rankings and the bracket and whatever Alabama's postseason plans are. We'll kind of play that one by ear. We'll see what happens Friday, Saturday with conference championship games, and then Sunday with the final playoff rankings release and the final bracket. So we'll be back to discuss that, what ultimately happens, what's coming ahead for the Crimson Tide. In the meantime, though, be sure to rate and review this show wherever you listen to your podcast, Apple, Stitcher, Spotify, even our Bama 247 YouTube page. Subscribe to Bama 247 and 24/7 Sports. We didn't even touch on hoops today because we ran long with our football conversations, but they had a pretty big win on Wednesday night, so they're rocking and rolling. Maybe we'll have a hoops conversation next week to fill some of the content gap. But yeah, a lot going on at Bama 247 and 24/7 Sports. So come along and enjoy the ride with us. As always, we appreciate you guys for listening. Talk to you all again soon.